Gary.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for the warm introduction. It's nice to see lots of familiar faces around the room. This is a very exciting time to be in the financial services industry or to be a business leader in any industry, and that's because we're entering into this new digital age. Sometimes it's called the fourth industrial revolution, as Gary mentioned. So just by way of background, the first industrial revolution brought us steam power. It was invented in England, the late 18th, early 19th century. That was followed by electrification and mass production, so think Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company. The third era was the era of telephony and telecommunications, and ultimately the first digital age, so the invention of the semiconductor, the mainframe, mini computer, PC, the internet, and the mobile web. And now we're entering into this fourth stage, where technology is ubiquitous. It's part and parcel of our daily lives. It's integrated deeply into our business and into every industry. And there are lots of these new technologies that people talk about in reference to this new digital age. You know, AI and machine learning. We're in one of the main global centers of AI and machine learning in Toronto. Technology in our bodies, autonomous vehicles, new clean tech, all these new kinds of technologies. And each of them is important in its own right, but there's this one technology in particular which is going to be foundational to driving the next era of change, a new operating system for this new digital age, and that's this thing called the blockchain. So who's heard of this? No, I'm just kidding. Everyone's heard of blockchain. It's Bitcoin, right? No. Let me explain what I mean by this sort of operating system analogy. So the first era of the internet was the internet of information. And it was a very powerful tool that changed how we communicate and how we share and access information online. And as a result, it had a big impact on certain industries like advertising and publishing and education and retail and these kinds of things. Except when you use the internet today to send and move and share information, you're not actually sending an original, unique thing. You're sending a copy, and you're retaining an original. So if you think about it, if I send an email to one person, I can send the same email to someone else. If I host a website, anyone can access it. If I put something into Twitter, it's available for all to see. And that's actually a very interesting and powerful tool. It's like everyone has their own printing press for information. Except when it comes to things that have value, assets, like money, or bonds, or equities, or virtually anything that requires scarcity, being able to send a copy of something is actually a terrible idea. So instead of an email, if it's $20, sir, and I send that to you, it's very important that you know you have the only version of that $20. Because if I can copy $20 the way I can copy an email or I can copy a tweet, then that money becomes worthless. So it's great for people to have a printing press for information, but it's not great to have a printing press for value or for assets. And this is a very specific computer science problem that people have been trying to figure out for some time. It's called the double spend problem. How do you ensure that when you move or transact in an asset on the internet, in a digital medium, that you don't leave behind an extra copy somewhere? And because it's been such a difficult problem to solve, we still basically rely on intermediaries, middlemen, to sit in the center of transactions, which is interesting. Ground control to Major Tom. That's the voice of God telling you blockchain is for real. So what's interesting about this is that the internet has profoundly changed information industries, but not value industries like financial services, because basically middlemen, intermediaries still play this really important role. And traditionally, intermediaries are banks, insurance companies, brokerages, governments. But increasingly, they're big social media companies like Facebook or big digital conglomerates like Google and Amazon and others. And overall, these intermediaries do a pretty good job, but they have some very specific limitations. The first is that they're centralized, and anything that is centralized is vulnerable to hacking or to attack. And we see this with regularity in the financial industry, Equifax, for example, and also in the technology industry as well, Yahoo, even in government, the State Department, et cetera. The second thing is that they add cost and friction to transactions. So, I used to work in the securities business. To clear and settle a trade, the clearing component might happen instantly, but the settlement component takes T+2 or T+3. It involves, brokerages, clearinghouses, custodians, transfer agents, and all sorts of legacy institutions that have been around for quite some time. And that adds a cost, which translates into friction in the economy. The third big issue is that they exclude big parts of the population. So there's a big portion of the world that's unbanked, who can't access basic financial services, which of course is basically the ability to move and store value and to access credit. And then the fourth issue is that they capture all this data, right, about our daily lives, which is problematic because we can't monetize that data and it could be used against us. So what if the internet was entering the second era, from an internet of information to an internet of value? Well, in 2008, an anonymous person or persons called Satoshi Nakamoto created this thing called Bitcoin. Who's heard of Bitcoin? Just kidding. Everyone's heard of Bitcoin. Who owns Bitcoin? Serious question. More of you should know. It's not investment advice, but it's interesting. What's interesting about Bitcoin is that it was designed to do something very simple. It was designed to be cash for the internet, a way to move value peer-to-peer without an intermediary online. And what was interesting about it is that it actually worked, and it's worked pretty well, to the point where it set off this spark and captured people's imaginations in lots of different industries, including in financial services. If we can create a version of cash that can be moved peer-to-peer online, what other kinds of assets could we digitize? So for the first time in human history, we have a digital medium for value, a way to move and store and manage assets peer-to-peer, where trust is not established by a third-party intermediary who's keeping an account of who owes what to whom and who owns what, but rather through a combination of collaboration, consensus, and clever code. And that is an important shift that is powering one of the biggest transformations in business today. So Gary mentioned before I got on stage that I've got a book coming out. I'm a co-founder of this thing called the Blockchain Research Institute, which is the largest independent think tank in the world focused on blockchain. Our members include CIBC and Manulife and TMX and the Government of Canada, but also Exxon, FedEx, IBM, Tencent, Fujitsu, PepsiCo, Delta Airlines, Coca-Cola, and other companies. And we've been doing a lot of research on financial services. I've written a foreword in the first chapter and edited a book of our best research on the subject. And it covers a number of different areas, everything from insurance to lending to capital markets and everything else. And this is an analogy that I find helpful to use when thinking about the industry. So who knows what that thing is? It's called a Rube Goldberg machine. You may have seen a viral video of a Rube Goldberg machine. So basically, a Rube Goldberg machine is this apparatus that performs all of these sort of ridiculous and complex and unnecessary steps, and in the end it solves a simple problem, like it cracks an egg or closes a door or something like that. This is basically the way the whole financial industry works. And I'm seeing some heads nodding because I think a lot of people kind of recognize that. You know, if you tap your card on the card reader at Starbucks to buy a coffee, you may think that the money is moving from you to the merchant instantaneously, but it's not, right? There's the acquiring bank, there's the merchant's bank, there's the credit card processing company, there's a payment system, there's a risk management overlay that usually does a check on the person for fraud, et cetera. And this process takes days, and in the end, the merchant pays an interchange fee. If you're talking about the world of securities trading, you know, high-frequency traders measure competitive advantage in nanoseconds, which is why they put their trading desks next to the server farms rather than in the nice parts of, you know, Midtown New York. But when it comes to time to clear and settle the trade, the process is very similar to what it was in the 90s or the 80s or the 70s or even earlier. And that's about to change. So this is a continuum to think about financial technology innovation, and specifically blockchain. So centralized finance are trusted intermediaries that perform many of the same roles as they used to. Entities like commercial banks, the SWIFT system, or Fed ACH, if you're familiar with that in the US, or central banks. Decentralized finance are these sort of anarchic, decentralized models of creating value where you don't need any trusted intermediaries at all in the center. And the best example of this is Bitcoin. My belief is that most of the innovation is probably going to happen in the center, where institutions that you work at, banks, law firms, lenders, insurance companies, et cetera, will have to integrate this technology into the core of your business. But you may not go extinct, so please don't worry about that. So it turns out that there are 9 different parts of the business that blockchain is going to impact. And I think this 9-figure graph is a way to think about financial services. So financial services is not just some industry like, you know, manufacturing or retail or hotels. It's the lifeblood of global commerce. It is the engine that powers the movement of goods and value in our economy. And it's complex from the outside looking in, but it does these 9 basic things. So identity, so KYC and AML, this is something everybody here has to do every time you approve a loan. The storing of value, so what banks do, or what safety deposit boxes, a way to store value. Moving money, so this is elemental to how financial services works, which is the ability to move money between parties. Lending value, so again, connecting people who need access to credit with those who are prepared to lend it to them. Funding and investing, so the connection of people with risk capital who want to invest into startups or other businesses to help fund their growth. Exchanging value, the ability to transact in financial assets, from bonds and stocks to titles and deeds of property and everything else. Insurance and risk management. Analyzing value, so big data analysis, and accounting and audit. So the ability to organize financial information into a simple, straightforward sort of way of doing it, so that you can build businesses and do things on an international scale. Each of those 9 things is going to be impacted. I don't have time to go through all of them, but I want to talk about a couple. So identity. So we're entering into this new stage of human history where data is the most important asset class. You may have heard this. It's sort of a well-worn line, but it's true. During feudal times, land was the most important asset during the agrarian age. And then it was industrial plant and equipment and oil that became the most important asset. And now it's data. If you look at the market capitalization of the top 10 companies in the world, 20 years ago, they were PetroChina, Exxon, Chevron, Shell, General Electric, so industrial companies, oil and gas companies, et cetera. Today, they're Google, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Tencent, et cetera, right? These are companies that are built, some of them make products, some of them sell services, but they are built on an empire of user data. And the way it works, and has worked for the past 20 or so years, is we've basically made this trade-off that we actually haven't been aware of, this bargain where we get access to free services, and then we trade for those free services all of our information. And it seemed like a good deal at the start, but increasingly it's seeming like a worse and worse deal, because we're not capturing any of that value, and it turns out that that data is going into the hands of the wrong people and could harm us, could harm our privacy, and could harm our freedom. So that's a form of digital feudalism. The new way to think about it is a citizen-owned identity, where individuals have sovereignty over the data that's important to them. So to bring it back to this discussion, in the context of lending, a lot of the information that you get about an individual is not from them, it's from some third party, from a credit scoring company like an Equifax or something like that, or it's brought in through other third parties. And ultimately, if you want to get a loan, and you're a lender, and you say, I need to know some information about you, if the person says no, then you're probably not going to give them the loan. So it's not like this is the end of you having an informed decision-making process. It just means that the individual provides consent. And it turns out that the data, if recorded to a blockchain, this distributed ledger that allows us to record information in an accurate and immutable way, if that's the source of your data, then it turns out that it can be a lot more accurate and more robust than the stuff that you're getting today. There was a study that was done that said that people's eBay score, Uber score, is a better indicator of creditworthiness than their credit score, right? I mean, we're using these tools which are incredibly antiquated when we have access to all this data. Now, I'm not advocating for that. What I'm saying is we can get to a next level where it's the individual who owns all of that information about their digital self, and they share it with you. So your default risks will go down, you'll be able to do more business, and the individual will have more privacy. Moving value, stable coins. So stable coins are crypto assets that track the value of a traditional currency, like the US dollar. And there are different kinds of forms of stable coins. The first cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, were not stable coins. They came out of civil society. They were grassroots, organized things. Now we're seeing 2 new kinds of stakeholders come in. Central banks, so governments, more or less, and private enterprise. So Mark Carney, at an important speech at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, a couple of months ago, said, and he's on his way out as the Bank of England governor, so he's really like swinging for the fences here, basically said that the US dollar should not be the global reserve currency of the world, which it has been since Bretton Woods in the 1940s. Instead, he said there should be a synthetic hegemonic currency. So what does that mean? Basically, if every single government currency is a cryptocurrency, and there are lots of properties that make that interesting, then the currency of the world should be sort of a basket. And if you're a student of history, you know that this was something that was actually proposed by John Maynard Keynes at Bretton Woods, but he had no leverage because the Brits were bankrupt after the Second World War. Private companies are doing something similar. So Facebook launched this thing called Libra. Libra is also a stable coin backed by a basket of other cryptocurrencies, and it's got a number of high-profile companies as members, but it has encountered significant backlash from lots of different stakeholders. A lot of the initial founders of the Libra consortium were FIs. They were MasterCard and Visa and others. And they have quickly backed out of this project for fear of regulatory and government reprisals. Facebook was dragged before Congress, where basically they made them out to be a villain looking to destroy the US dollar as the global reserve currency. I don't know if that'll happen, and I'm not sure if Facebook is going to be successful. But I can tell you that the genie's out of the bottle at this point. You know, it's early stages, but the contours of this future are quite clear. And if it's not Facebook, then it'll be Amazon. And if it's not an American company, then it'll be Alibaba or Tencent or someone else. And in fact, the Chinese government, the President Xi Jinping, just announced that blockchain is going to be foundational to the future of the Chinese digital economy. Now, he's not advocating for decentralized, sovereign, free, individualistic financial services. He's advocating for something else, which is a command and control system. But still, this is a frontier, I think, in this sort of growing power struggle between these two big countries. Exchanging value. So crypto, people think of crypto as currencies only, right? And they're not. Crypto assets represent different kinds of digital assets. Currencies are something specific, a unit of account, a medium of exchange, and a store of value. But there are other kinds of tokens. Stable coins, crypto fiat currencies and stable coins, one example, and securities tokens. Certain kinds of securities, things like equities or bonds that settle to cash, are really good use cases for this technology. Because a stock, like an equity, is basically just a contract. It is a contract that entitles you, the bearer, to a share of this thing, company, enterprise, and a stream of cash flows that pays dividends, and certain rights like the ability to vote on material changes, right? Like whether you want to move your headquarters from Canada to the US and take on a horrible name. And these kinds of properties can all be digitized. And it's a good opportunity to basically streamline the system. So clearing and settling of securities is something that happens with finality and happens peer-to-peer and happens instantaneously. So if you look at the marketplace for different asset classes, crypto assets are about $250 billion. The global equity market is around $100 trillion. And everyone knows that bonds and other fixed income products are bigger still. So there's lots of reasons why this technology can be successful. There are some reasons why it may not reach its potential. The technology itself is not the main bottleneck at this point towards growth. I think the biggest bottleneck towards growth is pressure from incumbents and resistance from governments specifically. And it's not an easy task that governments and regulators have. We're talking about an industry, a technology that's not impacting lightly regulated industries like publishing, though there are some rules there. We're talking about finance, which is the most heavily regulated industry. So this is going to be a big challenge, and it's one that I think is going to define the next sort of decade of growth of this technology. In terms of incumbents, there are lots of people who have been sort of openly skeptical of this technology. What's interesting about this is that Jamie Dimon, I have a lot of time for Jamie Dimon, and I think he's a good CEO. And as a result of, and if you look beyond this stupid quote, JP Morgan is actually spending more money than almost any other bank in the world on blockchain, fintech, and other initiatives. So sorry to pick on Jamie Dimon, but he has $1 billion. I don't feel that bad. So we've seen, though, throughout history that there are other examples of leaders of old paradigms resisting the new, pushing back against change. And we've seen this obviously in the technology industry with the invention of, the printing press originally, but radio, the telegraph, the internet, the personal computer, et cetera. So technology has no moral agency. It's not good or bad. I don't think that blockchain in and of itself is going to make the world, a fairer, more open, more inclusive place, and I don't think it's necessarily going to make the financial industry that much better. I think it holds a lot of potential to, but like any tool, it can be used for good and it can be used for bad. So there is an opportunity to do that, but there is also a way to use this system, which allows you to have perfect information about the movement of value anywhere in the world in every single asset, to extend surveillance capitalism and surveillance society and make the world a less free place. And I think we're seeing initiatives like that happening in Asia today. So I'll leave you with this. There's a parable about the invention of chess, and I think it's Chinese in origin, where basically the king, the emperor, is so pleased with this game that has been brought into his court that he offers the inventor anything he wants, whatever his heart desires, as a reward. And the inventor, sort of slyly, says, oh, I'm just a humble man. All I want is some rice to feed my family. But I want you to give it to me in this way. 1 grain on the first piece of the chessboard, 2 grains on the second, 4 on the third, 8 on the fourth, and so on and so forth. And the emperor, who is not like a math guy, says, yeah, whatever, how much rice can that be? A bag of rice, a big barrel of rice, humble request from a humble man. Of course, 8 becomes 16, becomes 32, becomes 64, becomes 128, so on and so forth. So by halfway through the chessboard, it's more rice than the entire empire can produce in a single year. And by the end of the chessboard, it's enough rice to cover the whole planet in 6 feet of rice. There's a corollary to that story, which is the emperor gets very pissed off, chops the guy's head off. Fortunately, we're not living in those times, and that's not going to happen to you. I hope not. But this is a good analogy to sort of describe where we're at today. Technology has transformed the world in really profound ways. The first digital age has made many industries unrecognizable. And I think today we're probably right around that middle of the chessboard stage. But financial services is an industry that has remained, in many respects, immune to a lot of the big shifts that have upended other industries. But that's going to change too, because this unstoppable force is coming up against the immovable object of the industry. And the impact is going to be cataclysmic, I believe. So thank you very much.